Hi, my name is Askold Melnyczuk. I'm the editor of Arrowsmith Press, and this is another conversation in our series, For the Record, interviews with Ukrainian writers. Today I'm speaking with Yuliya Musakovska, a Ukrainian poet and translator and a member of PEN Ukraine. She's the author of 5 poetry collections: Exhaling, Inhaling, Masks, Hunting the Silence, Men, Women, and Children, and most recently, The God of Freedom. Her poems have been translated into English, German, Spanish, Lithuanian, Hebrew, Polish, and Bulgarian. Musakovska also translates Swedish poetry into Ukrainian and contemporary Ukrainian poetry into English. She's the recipient of numerous literary awards in Ukraine, including Krok Publishing House's Dictum Prize, the Smoloskip Poetry Award, the Ostrov Academy Vitovki Award, Vitoki Award, the Bohdan Antonish Prize, and the Hranslov Award. Yuliya, welcome.
Thank you, Askold. Thank you for welcoming me here and doing this very nice introduction.
Well, it's a remarkable series of accomplishments, given that this is not your day job. But before we get there, I'd love to hear a little bit about where you grew up, under what circumstances, what town, what part of Ukraine, and what that was like.
I was born in Lviv, and I was born to a multinational family, I would say, and I think it influenced a lot, not only my poetry, but my approach to life in general. So from my mother's side, I have both Armenian and Polish, Ukrainian roots, and from my father's side, it's Russian, but territories that have been actually inhabited with ethnical Ukrainians. It's Kuban. So in my home, we've been speaking different languages, and I've heard different languages from the early childhood. Also, my father was very much interested in learning foreign languages, and he passed that interest to me and my brother. And when I started reading, I was taught reading in Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish simultaneously. My grandmother, that's a different story and a pretty complicated one. She was basically deported from Poland at the end of World War II, along with many other ethnic Ukrainians who lived on the territory of Poland. So when she came to Ukraine, she brought her Polish with her, and she passed that on. So I remember when she taught reading to me, reading in Polish, and we had this book called Elementarz, which means the ABC, in fact, for children to learn how to read. So the love of languages was always present at our home. And my parents, although we were Russian speaking at home, they thought it was just natural to send me and my brother to the Ukrainian school because we lived in Ukraine, and it was just a very simple thing, very simple decision to take. So it was fascinating. It was always fascinating to me to work with a language and with various languages. I think I started writing poetry or trying to write poetry when I was a child. And it was also very natural because our home was filled with books, and I started reading pretty early. I was mostly interested in fairy tales, and it's for a child. It's of course something that makes your imagination fly, and brings you to a totally new world. And I think that made some impact as well. So when I started writing poetry or rhyming, I would say, for me, it was like creating some kind of separate world of mine that only belonged to me. I think when I think about it, it's actually the same what I feel right now, because for me, I have my daily job and my daily life, and then there's poetry, there's literature. Although right now, I think in the times of war, everything is blending. So,
what an important point you make about the kind of multilingual childhood you had, and of course how commonplace that is in that part of the world. My mother grew up in Przemyśl in Poland, and so and her grandmother was Polish, and her father was Ukrainian. And you know how those things go. So Polish and Ukrainian were both simultaneous languages, and of course I also knew Russian and French. And my father was from Chernivtsi, and where Romanian was the language spoken officially, and then of course Ukrainian was the language at home. So that's a very commonplace thing. For some reason, that seems to confuse a lot of the outside world, because people get very anxious. Here you are, Ukrainian, but you're growing up in a Russian-speaking home, and yet it's important for people to understand that is. I mean, if you're growing up in Switzerland, you might be growing up in a German-speaking home, or a French-speaking home, or an English-speaking home, right? So that it's strange that is puzzling to people. Were either of your parents literary? The fact that they had so many books.
My father, he has always been very curious and talented man, but he grew up in Soviet times, and that was quite a challenge. So he studied at a school that was specializing in English, and he was very good at it. He was very good at foreign languages, and he entered the university pretty easily. But that's where the trouble began. So he's a very freedom-loving man with an open mind. And of course, Soviets were not happy about that. He was sticking out too much. And he was, I would say, he was a bit rebellious, and he loved the Western culture, and of course was not acceptable at that time. So he got in very big trouble. And basically, he wasn't able to continue his studies. And I would say that he was put into a lot of pressure. So he didn't fulfill what he was in fact made for. So he was trying to pass his aspirations and his skills to his children. And I think he did a marvelous job there. So he loved books, and the love for books resulted in a huge library at home. And also, it was a library in various languages. It's not pretty frequent when, at that time, people had a lot of English books at home, and we did. I started learning English pretty early. I think at 5, wow. I already knew 100 of English words, and I tried to read. But of course, that's thanks to my father, because he was trying to develop that.
Who were some of the writers that you were reading as a child? That's so interesting.
You mean the English
language? English. Like, yes, because of course it's very fun. Here I was in the United States, and my first language was Ukrainian, and so I read most of these writers. I came to reading English writers much later myself. You probably read them earlier than I did.
Well, there were a lot of different classics adaptations. Of course, the choice of books could not be compared with modern times. Those books that one could get hold on in Soviet times was pretty scarce. So I remember classics like Jack London stories, and a lot of fantasy books. I think it's Asimov and many other, we would say, pretty popular classic authors. Sure. But I think what got to us was adaptations of all these things, because in that time the literature had to be censored in order to be available in the states of the state of the Soviet Union. My father also liked beatnik authors, and for me it was a huge discovery. I remember reading the Ginsberg's Howl, and I think it was only the part 2 that was available. Wow. Because part 1 was too too brave
Too risky, yeah.
to be included anywhere. So for me, it was a discovery of a completely different world. And also I remember Lawrence Ferlinetti's poems that depicted America, and I felt like I was traveling in America when I read his poems.
That's one, it's funny you mentioned him because he was actually the first writer I ever wrote to.
What a coincidence.
And when I was in high school, and 35 years later, I became his publisher. So we've actually published a book of his work. And so,
amazing.
Yeah, that's funny. So as you move from being a child, sort of beginning to get a feel for language, to a young person in school, reading more deeply and widely, and then you move into the kind of public realm of the literary world, and every sort of region and every country and every culture have their own sort of processes for entering into the public game of literature, if you will. And I wonder if you could say something about what that was like for you. What was it? Where did you go to meet and read contemporary Ukrainian poets and national poets and international poets? What was that scene like?
I was already discovering some of my favorite Ukrainian poets at school. So I think the first ever poetry that really deeply touched me, it was in I think 5th or 6th grade when we read Лісова пісня by Леся Українка, because it actually included everything that I was interested in, the beauty of the word, the magical world, and also the aspiration of being true to yourself, preserving who you are, and the love for freedom as such. And then I found some of my important poets like Igor Kalinets and Hricko Chubay. It was a little later.
It's one thing to be reading the classics, and I think all young writers have those early influences, but then it's something very different when you begin to encounter the living word off the page. And what was that experience like? Where did you go to readings in coffee shops? Was the culture of popular readings a big thing in view the way it developed in the US after the beatniks?
Actually, I am one of those introverts who are very much into researching first and then going out to meet people. So when I started writing poetry in a more mature age, I would say after my university years, because I was very much devoted to my studies, and then I started working pretty early, and it was not the time for poetry, of course. And then after I established myself as a professional, I would say, I had that free space, that resource that I needed to be fulfilled in some way. And that was coincidentally the era of internet portals and also the literary portals. So an introvert as I am, I thought it was a great idea to just publish some poetry anonymously and see how people react, because I never had a possibility to be a part of, let's say, a literary studio or some kind of organization, which are pretty popular in Ukraine and were pretty popular, and I'm sure in Lviv too. But I think I missed that time, and then it was too late to become a part of such, because this is basically a community for students or even school children. So I was thinking where to start, and the literary portals seemed like a pretty logical place to just showcase.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is, of course, a completely different process, a generational difference for sure. Were these local literary portals, or were they national, international ones, or and did you get responses to the work that inspired or encouraged you to go on?
These were Ukraine-wide portals, and there were several of them. I think one of them is Gogolevska Academia, like a Gogol Academy, and it actually connected aspiring authors from all over Ukraine, and some of them are pretty big names right now. And we all started there, and of course, I got quite a lot of feedback, and it was at first surprising, and then, of course, encouraging. So then I started to research a little more, and I found out that there were different literary prizes that you can submit to and get some kind of more professional response, because the literary portals are for all kinds of people, and there are different tastes and different levels of expectations. And when you're getting praised, sometimes you don't believe it. And,
Sure.
yeah, you're looking for some kind of professional criticism. So for me, it was submitting to some literary prizes and getting the response from there. And I think it was that time when I started thinking of myself as a poet, that I could be a poet. I'm not just a person that works her daily job, but I'm creating something, and that is in fact valuable to some people, to some extent. I studied in the same group as a very famous translator from into Swedish, Levko Hrycuk, who is no longer with us, unfortunately. And it's a huge loss, of course, to the Ukrainian and to the Swedish literature, because he did a lot on the translation side and on connecting the Swedish and Ukrainian culture scenes. It happened that he was putting together an anthology of translations of Swedish classics to Ukrainian, and he just offered me to contribute. And I told him, Levko, but I have never translated poetry in my life. And he said, it doesn't matter, you are a poet. You speak Swedish, so you can do it. So he encouraged me, and that's how it started. And then I think I started translating with some of the classics, and among them Karin Boye, who I'm calling the Swedish Leta Ukrainka, because they're very much alike in both their life stories and their style of writing. And they were living at the same time, at the same period of time. And then
what about Lagerlof?
Yes. And then I don't remember how it started, but I started translating Transdromer because Levko was doing it too. So we were doing different poems and sometimes the same poems, and then comparing how we did on those ones. And we even had a performance with one of the Transdromer's personal friends, and he's an actor, Leif Ulsson, who came to Lviv to read on behalf of Thomas Transdromer, who was not speaking at that time anymore due to his health issues. So there was a wonderful event in Lviv where we read Transdromer's poetry in both Swedish and Ukrainian translations. Me and Levko had about 50 or 60 poems translated in total, and we made some attempts of trying to get these published, but these were unsuccessful. So I hope that the time
for publishing, yeah, sure,
to publish those, because there was a huge deal of work done on that side. And Transdrummer is a wonderful poet, and he influenced me a lot as well. The beauty of tiny details, and yes, how he was looking at nature and seeing completely different things. And of course, it also had some sort of magic in it. Although he's describing very simple things, but actually they are not.
Absolutely, no, I agree. I mean, there's that wonderful poem about I put my hands into my Haydn pockets.
Yeah,
About Haydn, and then there's another
translated
one.
that.
You did. How wonderful! There's another poem of his that I remember. I remember hearing him read it. It was because I also recall that he was a social worker, and so he did a lot of visiting of people in their homes. And in this case, he's describing visiting some kind of very crass, very wealthy family, and the speaker walks into the house and he says, looking around the very nice house, he says, "Ah, you live very well. The slum must be inside you." So yeah, and are there any other Swedish poets who you worked with or worked on?
No, I didn't have a chance to expand this portfolio because, as I said, I was collaborating a lot with Levko, and I needed that sort of partner to keep doing this, as I'm pretty engaged in my daily job, and
Sure.
I just cannot steer that on my own. So I think that he was very active on that side and was trying to keep me active as well. I did some of the individual translations, but then I got interested in another direction, is translating the Ukrainian poets into English, especially those that are not very known or not known at all.
That's very challenging. My goodness. Who were some of the writers you translated? Because you also, just in passing, mentioned that you spent some time in the States on an exchange program in high school. Oh, where were you?
Yeah. It was Alexandria, Virginia.
Wow.
It's not far from DC. I think I was 15 when I went there, and my parents didn't want me to go because they thought I was too young. And then I think I insisted very much, because for me it felt like a chance to see the world. And of course it was a very complicated process to go through to get to be a part of such a program. So I thought I was working so much and I deserve it.
Sure. Sure. And did you maintain ties with anybody from that period?
Yes, I still am.
Nice.
I have some of the friends that are also in Alexandria, and some of them that moved to different places. But we maintain contact, and even when my poem got published recently in Agni magazine, I sent 2 of these old friends the copies.
Oh yeah.
And they were pretty much excited.
Nice.
It's nice to have social media, of course. In fact, we lost each other for some time, and then with Facebook we were able to reconnect, and it's very valuable. I realized that I didn't address your question about the authors I was translating into,
sure.
into English. So some of the authors that I have translated are Iya Kiva and Mariana Savka.
Oh.
And for example, there was a poet from Vinnytsia, Serhij Kabara, and Anna Chromova-Fleitman, who is a Ukrainian Israeli poet. And of course, I did some individual poems, and I would love to work on a larger selection, but it all is a matter of time and how you can plan it. But I really enjoy it, and I feel that it's very important, because English is a universal language, and it gives access to a large audience to be able to discover these authors.
Absolutely. No, it's a and there's something very generous about the act of translation, but also it can be very restorative to one's own work. It enlarges your own sense of your own possibilities as well. So yeah, that it's. I so look forward to reading those English translations of the writers you've mentioned. I've also translated some of Savka, and I've only recently discovered Iakiva's poetry, which I've been very moved by. So then let's go on then to the next stage of your sort of entering into the literary world while also pursuing a different sort of professional life. Your first book was published. What was that like? That's a milestone in every writer's life, transformative experience, or perhaps not.
Well, the first book was an accident.
Really?
So, yes, I think I got the manuscript composed because I was submitting it to various literary awards. So I got that in hand. And once at a Lviv Forum Festival, I met a head of a publishing house, Fact, that was publishing young poets at that time. I think it was 2010 or 2009. And bold as I was, I gave him the paper copy, and then we exchanged email addresses. And of course, I wrote to inquire, did he like it or not? And then I got a response in the evening saying, "You ruined my working day. I was reading your poetry the entire day, and I couldn't do anything else." So I got an offer to do a book, and it was, of course, very new to me. And now I think that it was too early to do that. So somehow maybe I needed some more time to analyze and to, to sit on this. And I was just so excited at that time. I thought it was very important to me. And now I would probably leave this manuscript for a couple of years to think it over, maybe to improve it.
But I was just going to say that the American poet Louise Gluck has said that everybody has to have a first book, and so it's a threshold you have to cross.
Yeah, and also I think it was important because I had a presentation of that book at the Smoloskip publishing house office, where they hold a lot of different events. So it was an opportunity to get to know some of the people from the community of authors, and I made various interesting connections. And I just learned that there was such thing as a Smoloskip literary award. And then I decided to apply or to submit my work. And in the next year, after my first book got published, I got the Smoloskip Poetry Prize that resulted in the second book to be published. So it was going very fast for me.
Yeah. Life in the fast literary lane. And was it all good? Was it complicated? Was it
it was exciting, I would say.
Of course.
Also, when I discovered that Natalka Bilocerkiewicz, who is also one of my very important poets, was on the jury of this literary prize, and I approached her to write a foreword to the book, I never thought she would accept, because I was just a beginner poet, and of course she was who she is. And she in fact accepted. And I remember reading in this foreword to the book that was called Masks, and that was very very much about theater in a general context, and she wrote that this book is just a rehearsal. And at that time I was a bit disappointed in myself. I thought, well, maybe I'm not good enough, that is just a rehearsal, because every poet thinks that at this very time you're doing your very best.
Always, yes.
So now when I think about it, I think that she was, of course, right to say so, and she was doing so to inspire me. But it's the thing that I only realize right now.
Well, it's a very generous interpretation, but that's good. I think you're right, of course. To urge you to go further, there's always further to go in the art.
But it's something you cannot avoid. It's of course not about the prizes, and it's not about receiving praise. It's something you cannot help doing, because poetry is a way of living, a way of communicating with the world. So I think I would go on anyway.
Right. No, I agree entirely. But I think that writing something you need to do, that is to say, if you're going to be a writer, it's something you have to do. It's not something that you can leave to others to decide for you, whether the world accepts it or not. No, I agree entirely. So if there is a difference between your earliest work and your most recent work, what might you say characterizes the evolution or the change? What is it? Different subjects? Is it a different kind of a technical approach? And also, in terms of like poetic technique, here in the United States, I'm sure we have what's very popular for young writers is the whole kind of creative writing classes, where people go in and kind of do their master's degrees in writing, creative writing, where they study craft. And I imagine that was something that you worked out on your own in studying the craft. Was it through imitation that you learned, or was it through some other process of osmosis? That was it a very deliberate thing, to write syllabically, or to write stressed kind of iambic poetry, to rhyme? Was that because you're talking about, you've mentioned a number of very different kinds of aesthetic influences, and I'm wondering how you were sort of synthesizing them. What were the things that you were excited about trying? What were you rejecting? And then we'll move to more recent times.
Well, I never had just one single author that I wanted to be like, or I wanted to write like. Of course, as you mentioned, the mix was very versatile of the authors that I liked, and I think I was always trying to be myself, and to keep my let's say individuality on the creative side as well. I started with very traditional to the Ukrainian poetry style, syllabotonic verses, and that was, I think, because the first poetry that ever touched me was the song lyrics poetry. For example, my father was keeping the very thick notebooks with song lyrics written in them, and I spent a long time going through these lyrics and reading this poetry, and among them was, for example, Bob Dylan, that received a Nobel Prize in Literature and never thought it would be possible. But I think that kind of poetry was the first one, and it had music in it, and it
Right.
has rhythm in it. So for me, syllabotonics was very natural to start with. And then I started exploring free verse as well. And I think I write more in free verse right now than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. As to the topics, I have always been interested in human nature, in how human connections are formed on different specifics of the relationships, and just the psychological aspect of communications and interactions between people. And that was, of course, it also covered the romantic relationships and family relationships and so on. But something changed after the Revolution of Dignity. I think it was a turning point when I realized, and many people realized, that we're part of something much bigger, and it's time to focus not just on the inner world, but on the outer world. And that is also something that I learned from the Scandinavian poetry and also the contemporary Swedish poetry. It was a surprise to me that the Swedish poet, for example, is looking outwards, and the Ukrainian poet is mostly looking inward when we speak about the contemporary authors, especially, not the classics. So the Revolution of Dignity was the moment when you realized you cannot be just speaking about yourself or about some individual. You can still continue doing that, but you have to remember that there is something bigger you are part of. And it was also a moment of self-identification, the strongest moment, because of course I identified myself as a Ukrainian, but that moment it solidified that confidence and that identification.
Well, so you're bringing us up to date here, rather, to the start of the war in 2014, and it's one of the complicating elements in trying to explain to friends here what's been going on, because as you and others have pointed out, the war did begin in 2014. But I suppose that what I'd like to ask you now is what were you working on before the most recent sort of escalation of the war on February 24th? What were you working on before? And did you have a sense of what was coming at all? And then how has your life changed since then?
Well, I have been writing mostly about the war, and specifically the war with Russia after it started in 2014. Even if not large parts of Ukraine have been affected at that moment, I somehow felt that this war is on, and this war was present, even if I was not physically present in the war zone and it was not present where I was living. There were various signs. It's like being sticked by needles in different places. For example, the news of relatives and friends who got wounded or died at the battlefield in those parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, where the active fight zones were, and which were later occupied. Also, my husband's family lives not far from the military base in the Western Ukraine, and we were living for several years at that place. And there were times when we saw candles along the road, and it meant that there have been a soldier that died and that was being brought home, and was actually a very tragic experience, even if you don't know this person. Well, in fact, I think I have been taking personally what has been going on with Ukraine since the war started. It feels like it is affecting you and your family, because the entire Ukraine is your family. And I just couldn't I couldn't avoid speaking about it. I was not even trying to. So I think after 2014, war was present in almost every poem that I wrote to some extent. And as to premonition, in 2014, after Crimea was illegally occupied, I wrote a poem that was called "Men Are Carrying War Inside Them." And there was no discussion as such about the war. It was not called the war, and it was not expected as a large-scale war, but there was a feeling, and it was back 8 years ago.
Right, right.
It was all completely new and shocking to hear that in the peaceful time, as it seemed, young men and women had to go and fight and probably be wounded and killed. So I think it was a huge shift for the entire Ukraine, and for me as an author and as a poet. So basically the war came into my writing and it never left, because I was thinking about it, I was writing about it, I was trying to do what I can on my side, let's say supporting volunteers and communicating to people what was going on in Ukraine, not just starting end of February this year, but earlier as well.
Well, that's, yeah. I think that's one of the tragedies, and certainly the failure of many of us who knew what was going on but did not quite register it to the right degree. Certainly, you know, I visited Ukraine in 2017 and 2018, and I remember sitting outside of Arsenal in Kyiv and speaking with Oksana Zabushko and you know, others, and they're saying there's a war on, and I'm looking around and seeing this very beautiful city and all this life and all this excitement about books and literature. And it was a very hard thing to kind of register, to really kind of accept the dual realities. So that's a very long time to be living with that as your sort of influence and subject and material. And it's one of the things that has really surprised and interested me is, and perhaps it's because you've been living with it for so long, is how productive you and other Ukrainian poets I've spoken with have been in this period. That poetry had, that you know, you've not fallen silent. Poetry keeps getting written, and that it seems to be serving a very important sort of social function. And I wonder if you could say something about why it is that, you know, for instance, I've spoken to a number of writers here and elsewhere about how slow prose is, fiction is, to be able to kind of encompass contemporary realities, and poetry seems quicker to register it. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and if you can say what it is that you hope that poetry can achieve at such a time.
When you mentioned your trips to Ukraine in the recent years and not realizing that the war was on, it's not just for the people who come outside from abroad, but even for people in Ukraine. So for me, writing about the war was one possibility to remind people what's going on. to communicate, to stir that emotion, because somehow I think we are all responsible to some extent, that we didn't prepare as well as we could, knowing that this threat was hanging on us, and it was hanging, I think, since the independence, because one could analyze the past and the history, and how Russia behaved against Ukraine. So it was always possible. We just underestimated this possibility. And I think as citizens and as Ukrainians, and of course the Ukrainian government, everyone could have done better on preparing to what was about to happen.
Well, there's 1,000 years of history to look back on. Yeah.
Yes. Now we analyze it and we see what was pretty clear and obvious, but we could have seen it a little earlier, of course. So the poetry, I would say that, first of all, it serves a selfish purpose of poet being able to cope with what's going on. It's some sort of a remedy, even if it contains a lot of negative emotions. It's, let's say, sometimes you imagine it as a vessel, that this poem is a vessel which is filled with your emotions, and you're able to separate them from yourself. But it's also something that is uniting people against one strong emotion, and it's a feeling of unity, and it's a feeling of understanding what is going on, and probably that helps to cope with these events and gives you some energy to go on, because this is now, after 3 months of this full-scale invasions, we are all feeling tired. Of course, there is this talk abroad of Ukraine's fatigue, too many different news, negative emotions, right. And it's all very depressing, and people are getting tired. But it's people who are not living this war, and us living even in the cities that have not been much affected, because I think the entire Ukraine has been affected. We are feeling tired and exhausted. And of course, it's a crime to say so, because there are soldiers and volunteers who are working day and night and going through extreme challenges. But I think each of us is tired to some extent. And poetry is something that lifts spirits, even if it's our joint rage, it still gives us energy. And so we're trying to save ourselves, and on the way, perhaps it helps other people too.
Well, I think it very much does, because again, many friends I've been speaking with here say that they are turning to reading poetry much more these days than they are to prose or even journalism. And it's in part because of the way that poets manage to shatter kind of our encrusted, closed down, familiar, predictable perceptions, and kind of through the inventive use of language and through the sort of emotional charge of the poem to kind of wake us up and kind of keep waking us up to the complexity and importance of this particular moment. And it's somehow, reading it is consoling, and it sort of shatters that sense of isolation and solitude that I think everyone comes to feel when they have when they're overwhelmed by a force that seems beyond their control. Poetry somehow brings us back to our core self And
Also, there is a space for emotion, because when people are hearing news from Ukraine and even encounters from people who have lived through the disasters that we have experienced here, the disasters caused by Russians, they are getting overwhelmed, as you say, and they want to put a barrier between themselves and what is coming at them. And the poetry breaks this barrier, because it's allowed to contain emotion, because the emotion is the very core of poetry.
Yes.
So even when I performed abroad during these past months, people have approached and shared their impressions that they were hearing so many things on what's going on in Ukraine, but only from the poetry they felt what they think we are feeling now. So this brings this life experience closer, and people are able to relate to it. Well, of course, we hope so. That's our hope.
That's certainly what I'm finding. So to that end, I was hoping that you could read us a poem, both in Ukrainian and English. But before that, just is there anything else that you want to say to an audience here on the outside Ukraine before I ask you to do that? Anything at all beyond what we have said? Anything we have not touched on that you think is essential at this moment? Mind?
I would ask people to keep discovering Ukraine, and not just associated with the war, because Ukraine is so much more than the things that are familiar to the people all over the world. They know about our soccer players, they know about our Chernobyl. There may be some of the smaller things they're familiar with, but the Ukrainian culture is very rich, and it's also a foundation to what one can call modern day heroism, because this is what the entire world is seeing right now, how Ukraine resists. And Ukraine will resist, because we have no other choice. There is no option of surrender. This is the only way, and whether we will prevail or not is not a question. We have to. It's just the matter of the price that has to be paid, and of course, it's mostly about the price in people's lives.
So that's beautifully said, and I completely agree with everything you've just said. And it's so important for people to hear that, because of the very sort of narrow understanding of Ukraine that had been prevalent in the West, certainly in the United States. That has exploded open. I think that there is a general, if not universal, recognition that Ukraine is standing up for democratic values as opposed to against the dictatorship and authoritarianism. It is a fight for the soul of the world, and it's essential that people grow increasingly aware of it. So I wonder if you might read, in fact, the poem that was in Agni in both English and Ukrainian.
Actually, it's the first poem in my most recent book, The God of Freedom, and it was very nice coincidence that was also the first poem in the most recent issue of Agni. So I will read in Ukrainian first. Така любов, що аж у горлі клубок гарячий, без будь-яких напівтонів чи відносних значень, не у півсерця, а цілим сонцем і морем, так гіацинтово, фіалково і безумовно, така розхристана та надсадна, як ранок ранній, така разюча, незрозуміло, гоїть чи ранить, така обіцяна, зм'яклі коліна, розбитий панцир, як довгождана, але навмисне пропущена станція. Як гуркіт. І голос, який втішає. Гроза, гроза. Як вуличний музикант, зарізаний на підзамчі. Як протаранені кораблі, обмілілі ріки, як 155 дітей без батьківської опіки. Як назви втрачених місць, які не втомишся промовляти. Як благодать найвища і найгірше прокляття. Як чорна трава, спопелілі гнізда і шепіт пустки. Така любов, що вросла і ніколи вже не відпустить. So now I will read the English translation that we worked on together with Olena Jennings. Such love. Such love it is, a hot lump in your throat. It is without any half-tones or relative meanings, loved not half-heartedly, but with the full sun and sea. It is loved hyacinth-like, violet-like, and unconditionally. It is so uncovered and raw, like an early morning. It is so striking, you can't tell if it heals or wounds. It has been promised. Your knees go weak and your armor is broken. It is like a long-awaited train that you missed on purpose. It is like a roar, and a voice amidst it saying, "It's just a thunderstorm." It is like a street musician that has been slaughtered at Pizamche. It is like rammed boats and rivers that have gone shallow, like 155 children deprived of their father's care, like the names of the lost places which you're never tired of saying, like the highest grace and the worst curse, like the black grass, bird nests turned to ashes, and the whisper of the void. Such love it is, which has grown deep into you and will never let go.